All right, welcome everyone to tonight's very first session of the Author Advice Club. My name is Josette Dubois, and I'm the Adult Programs Librarian at the Slover Library in Norfolk, Virginia. And we are joined tonight by the Muse Writers Club. We have Susan, and then tonight's author who's going to be speaking with you is Patrick. He's stepped away for a second, it looks like, so while we're waiting for him to come back, Susan, do you want to tell everybody a bit about the Muse in case they don't know?
Sure. So the Muse Writers Center, we're in Norfolk, Virginia, but we have students from all over now that we've gone virtual thanks to the pandemic. So we have classes of all sorts, in all sorts of genres for all levels. And actually, our summer class schedule is going to be announced either tomorrow or the day after. This is big and exciting. And yeah, classes for everyone. We have full tuition assistance available for anyone who needs it. And it's just a really wonderful place. I'm the program manager there now, but I actually went to the Muse as a teen in the teen writing classes. So it's really wonderful to be able to work at a place that's so dear to my heart. And we do a lot of partnerships with Slover Library, which is, of course, also in Norfolk, which has been wonderful. And so the Author Advice Club is our newest one. And so each month we're going to have an event just like this where we have a Q&A with a published author. And it looks like our published author in question has just come back. Patrick, you want to tell us a little bit about what we're going to be talking about today?
Well, my story is very long, but I'll try to be a little brief. Uh, I did not come to writing early. I didn't come to books early. I I spent a good deal of my childhood and high school into college playing sports, and then when I couldn't play any sports anymore, I didn't know what I wanted to do. I had not read many books. I took an elective in college with George Saunders, and I wrote a story in there, and he took me aside after the class and said, I think this is something you should pursue. And so that was the first time anybody had ever kind of like initiated me into the arts at all. And so that was a big deal for me that someone would take notice or take time to read something of mine closely and encourage me to keep doing it. And I didn't know who he was. I had not read his books. I had not heard of him because I didn't know much about the literary scene. And so he was a mentor in a way because he had also told me to spend 2 years, away from academia and just kind of take everything in, observe, travel if I could. And I did. I lived in China for a while. I lived in Mexico, taught English as a second language, and just started reading a lot. I went to grad school back at Syracuse for 3 years. And if you're a young writer looking for, how to get into an MFA, I wasn't able to afford an MFA. So what I did was just look at schools that were offering full fellowships. And there's about 20 schools that do that now, and it's something to look into if you're struggling, uh, like I was, to find cash to pay for something that is difficult to um, qualify, I guess, or evaluate on what the potential of it is. But from there, I basically kind of learned almost how not to write. It was it was the opposite of what you hear from MFA programs. Maybe some of them are very structured in a way that's uncomfortable, but this was very open and very much find your own voice, and that's the first thing that I want to talk about today is this idea of how do you do that, and so I'll speak a little bit about that in a little bit, but um, after my time at Syracuse, I realized that I knew less than I thought I did, and so I really had to pursue like a reading just regimen, and I just read 3 books a week maybe, and just kept and I read all the stuff that probably what should have been read in high school, but I hadn't read it. But I'm kind of glad I didn't because for instance, I came to Of Mice and Men when I was 30, whereas most people come to it when they're 15. And so I had a very different experience with it. And there's a writer named Robert Stone who talks about the same thing, that he was at the end of Kerouac. T.C. Boyle talks about this too, that they were at the end of the Kerouac stream of consciousness writing thing, and but they were in the scene, but to them it was very depressing and obnoxious. And so their writing kind of pivots off of this on the road happy-go-lucky, and you kind of see this dark like strain that runs through much of like the mid-70s fiction. And so for me, coming to those books late really guided my voice. And then it was a matter of discipline and sticking with it, which is the second thing I'm going to be talking about. And for me, it took 3 agents, 270 book rejections, and I really could not give you the number of story rejections. I would imagine it's in the thousands. And so lots of rejection, lots of going back through old manuscripts, trying to revive them when I'd get an agent, trying to turn mud into gold, that kind of thing. And so what ended up happening is I had 2 agents try to sell a novel that I wrote, and they couldn't. And I was at the time teaching at Virginia Tech, and I was not satisfied being there. And so I invested all my time and energy into this one story that I had written back in 2007. And I knew that there was something in it that might be a book. And so I started going through it, and I was working a graveyard shift at a detox center, and I wrote most of the book there. And then I sent it to 5 agents who were representing short stories. And I am one of the rare cases where the agent found my book in the slush pile. The assistant had taken it out of the slush pile. And this is the last thing that I'll talk about when I discuss, publishing, was the reason that she found it was because of the title. And the title was To Feel Again the Kind of Love That Hurts Something Terrible. And I really think that it was just sticking out of the pile of trash that they were going to recycle. And she saw the title and picked it up and gave it to her boss. And from there, she was able to sell the book and sell. I had pieces of another novel, and she put them together. I had about 300 pages of just blah on a page, and she was able to put it all together and make it saleable. And so I got a pretty nice book deal and was able to, and like I said, we'll talk about this in publishing, but on a 2-book deal, you have to start thinking about, can I even write a novel? And so that's a scary process too, or else you have to pay the publisher back. So there's a whole stream of things that go along with it. And I wasn't that confident that I could, but I eventually did. And so that's a part of my story. I live right now in Richmond. I go back and forth between Richmond and Newport News. And the one thing that I do every day is that I write every day, no matter what's going on. I try to get something down in a notebook or on the computer, even if it's terrible. Just the practice itself is really what's most helpful for me. And so that's kind of like my opening introduction. If some of you would like to share with me what's going on in your writing world and successes and failures that you've had, I think we can go from there.
I just like to say thank you so much for such an honest sharing of the stresses of publishing, because not everyone admits that or shares that, and it's really great to hear, just because it's good to know what's in our future. So thank you so much.
Yeah. I think one of the big things is it's hard to harden yourself against rejection, and but especially in terms of stories, one thing that is good to understand is that if you're not sending to, say, New Yorker, Paris Review, Zoetrope, these big magazines, most likely you're dealing with graduate students, and they're going to be very subjective. I have tried to publish stories where I thought, oh, like this would easily get in here, and it was rejected right away, and then it got into like a very big magazine, and I just felt like that was because I was one of those graduate students. Like I read a lot of stories that came. Yeah, basically, if you're doing stories, understanding that you're dealing with graduate students, and that's very subjective. If you're doing bigger magazines, understand that there are 20,000 submissions a month. You know, at the New Yorker, it's probably 30,000, and so you're working your way through it. And sometimes I'm just like, how do people have that many stories? You know, where? So um, it's a lot of competition, but it's not something that. So one story I'll tell you is that I went and met with an agent in a New York office that was very much like you would have seen in a 1980s stockbroker movie. There was I believe the whole table was glass. There was glass, pitchers of water, like little sandwiches that looked like no one that had been there forever. I mean, but they were also fresh. Like no one ever ate the sandwiches, and you could see the whole city skyline outside. It was a very famous agent, and he told us a story of having dinner with um, who was it? Henry Miller and not Henry Miller, Arthur Miller, and I can't remember who's the guy who ran all of Cuba. Why is the name escaping me? Someone help me out with the guy who ran Cuba. Oh, I'm not the only one who doesn't know.
Are you talking
No, but it's like right there on the tip of my tongue.
Castro or something like that?
Yeah, Castro.
That's it.
Fidel Castro.
Sorry. So he opened up his talk by telling a story about having dinner with Arthur Miller and Fidel Castro. So you can imagine where like my head was right then. And but one of the things he had said was they unlike how we kind of put a lot of this pressure on the form and structure, and then are we doing everything right to send out the work? Does everything look correct? Are we following all the guidelines? He said his main thing was just story. It was just a story. It didn't matter where you came from. It didn't matter if you had an MFA. It didn't matter a lot of these things. That what publishers are looking for are stories. What the agents are looking for are stories. And once you get into that other realm, it's a matter of, hitting the right time, getting someone at the right time, pulling in all your connections, whatever connections you have, and, making sure that your work is as solid as it possibly can be. If you don't feel good about it, or if you're on the edge of, if you're not sending out, if you're sending out, but you feel like, oh, they might not like this, then you probably want to pull it back. But if you're sending out saying, I feel good about this, that rejection is just natural. It's going to come. And yeah, after 270, you want to give up. But you still have that feeling that this thing is good and not, this thing is good. Like, I believe this is good. And so if you stay with that, I believe that something good happens with your manuscript, wherever it was meant to go, whether it's a big publisher or a small publisher. So at that meeting, he had mentioned something about how he knew of a very successful short story writer that was broke, but had a lot of cachet, and how that short story writer, he represented a romance writer. She just passed away, very well known, but it was like paperback romances, and so the short story writer said, I'm going to write one of these romances, because he needed some money. And so he went and wrote a romance, and it was terrible because he didn't know how to do it. That wasn't his voice. That wasn't his way of doing it. And that basically what he was saying is that the story is what matters, and that you're able to tell that story. And so your voice is what matters, and that your voice comes through on the page. And so to me, that was very eye-opening, because it made these publishers a lot more human, and it made me realize how daunting it is to get your manuscript through to one of them, just because there's just so much in the air. There's so many people trying. So how do we get it through? You know, that's the big question, and I have some ideas on that I can share as we move along.
I'll share a recent flash fiction piece I sent out just to kind of provide some inspiration for other writers. So I wrote this flash fiction piece called Byron's Rebellion, right? That was about orcas or killer whales. And when I submitted it to this prestigious magazine called the Vestal Review, right? And they rejected it first, but they said the editor wanted me to revise the piece. And I sent it, of course, to Patrick and a couple other writers to get. After I provided my revisions to it, I let them look at it, and took what made sense to me, and I said, okay, I may make these changes, or I may keep these things, or whatever. And even though they rejected me, right, he said, if you want to, right, I could send it back to them, even though he was kind of saying that there's a high chance that it won't go through, right? Now I could have just stopped and just said, okay, since there's really no point in me doing it, why should I do it? But instead I said, okay, I'm gonna go ahead and try it. So I did that. And the editor that I'm talking about, his name is David Galiff, and he has a book out that he put out for flash fiction and writing flash fiction. But anyway, when I put that out, I sent that out to him. He got back to me and said, yeah, this is exactly what we're looking for, and I would love to publish this. So from there, I was able to get another story published. And it's interesting because yesterday, during my poetry class with Susan, David got back to me and said that he just had a few copy edits that he wanted me to do, and then from there they're gonna put the piece in their magazine in June. So that's just some inspiration to put out there that you need to keep trying. Don't think that what you're doing is not working, or that you're not progressing, because you are. You just got to keep on going.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. I had one of those from the New Yorker, but then they didn't take it. So we can go either way on that. But that's always comforting when you get a note from an editor. And those notes from editors that you guys, if you do get them, it's very important to hang on to them. Editors move around, and I had one editor. The way that I got connected with the Paris Review is that I had an editor from another magazine end up becoming the fiction editor at the Paris Review. Then he almost took a story. When he left, he gave my information to the new editor, and it was something weird like that. But I had just kept in contact. So it's always important that, especially if you get a note, a lot of these notes are form rejections. Like in this past week, I have 2 form rejections, and that's still happening. So even if you do publish hardcover books with big publishers, rejections are still coming. But I believe in the work, so that's most important. One thing I'm going to do real quick is just show you a quick 2 videos on creativity. It's something that I do in classes sometimes, just to kind of show the difference, and it doesn't mean anything bad. Let's say if you're a big John Mayer fan, it's not saying anything bad about John Mayer, but what I'm going to show you is the creator of a song, and then someone playing that creator's song, and the difference that you will see just in their eyes and their motion. And whenever I talk about creativity, this is kind of what I'm talking about, is it's always that feeling where you're slightly above yourself, like you're slightly lifted, and you feel, I don't know, this kind of third thing that's happening. And I have rarely seen it, so much of it as I felt it, but I see it in this. And so let me share this with you. If you're having trouble seeing it, let me know. So first I'm going to play this, or if you're having trouble hearing it, let me know. What this is I'm just going to play the opening to this. It's the Grateful Dead. I think you all know who Jerry Garcia is. If you don't, he's got the bushy hair that we're looking at right in the front, lead guitarist. And once it gets to him, it's just really focusing on his eyes and like you can tell that he invented this. You know, you can tell that he created this and has now brought it into the world. And that's really the peak of creativity, I think. So that's what we're looking at here. So that's the first one, and that I just see someone who is like totally in control of this thing that they probably spent a few years working on. It's a 3-part sequence, and it's his creation. The other one I want to show you is, and again, it's not saying that you can't be creative with something else, but you can see the difference, I guess, in here. And it's the same band, everybody except for the lead singer, who is now John Mayer. And we are exactly 50 years later, I believe. Is my math right on that? Yeah, 50 years later. So everyone can see this one too? Yes? I think so. So I guess my point there, can you guys hear me now then too? Okay, good. My point there is not that one is, I mean, I think one is better than the other, but that one is the creator and one is someone who is recreating that thing. And so our job is to find our original voice and our own creativity, which is, to me, following that original voice. And that if you're not, what happens is you kind of get a lackluster, what that felt like, you know. You kind of know those concerts where someone's just going to hear the hits, right? They're never played exactly how you heard them on the album or how you felt them the first few times you heard them, or especially at a concert where everybody's singing the songs, right? So what you want is that ultimate creativity. You want that ultimate voice, that unique voice. And for me, it's following everything that comes in. And I think sometimes we get into a place where we feel like, oh, what came in is stupid, or what came in is not, that's not what I want to write about, or that's not useful, or something like that. We deny things that come in. And that's part of the whole hero's journey. That's part of writing anyway. You start off, okay, I want to do this thing. You get all your things together, you take some classes, or you get an MS now. And what now is finding that voice and that creativity. And so hopefully that's helpful. And yeah, let's open it back up to you guys, questions or maybe ways in which they.
Sorry, did you see Connie's comment in the chat about social media?
Do you do much on social media? Do you think that having a big following increases your chances of finding an agent publisher? I didn't until I sat down with the publisher. And so they gave me a Facebook and Twitter person, and that was their job. And that messed me up more than actually even doing Facebook and Twitter, because then I would constantly think about how this whole person's whole job was to look at people's Facebook and Twitter accounts, and then I felt bad. And so, yeah, I ended up doing a lot of, connecting on Facebook, connecting on Twitter. Twitter and Instagram, I would say, are the best ways to get something going. I would never post my writing on there. But, reaching out to fellow authors through all of those sites can be a lot more promising than you might think so at first. And for me, especially when I had to start doing blurbs for books, I had two really good authors that I knew personally that could do blurbs, but they want more. And what I did is I reached out to my favorite authors. I reached out to 20 people on Facebook. Some of them I didn't know if they ran their Facebook pages or not. And I think 4 or 5 of them got back to me and said they'd be willing to. But before that, I had kind of one thing that I started doing was if I read a book by a newer author, I would Facebook message them or send a direct message on Twitter and say, like, I really enjoyed your book. Just simple, not asking anything in return, just I thought it and why I thought it was great. And that was it. And then down the road, they usually reached back out to me to say that maybe they had read something of mine. If they had something else coming out, they could send it to me or direct it my way. They would retweet things that I tweeted. And so that's how you develop it. I think you find authors online, especially younger authors that are debuting their first books, even authors that are teaching at universities that you might be interested in if you're looking at an MFA or if you're looking to publish. But it's very much like it is in normal relationships, is like you develop a bit of a back and forth, not just help me with this. So recently I got a Twitter direct message about someone who I think they guiltily messaged me a long thing saying that they reached out to my agent and mentioned my name, but I'd never heard of them. And so it was a very strange position to put me in. And then they told me all about their book. And I had just said, and they had gotten a rejection, and I didn't really know exactly what to respond with it, but just kind of keep going. And, I think if you believe in your book, my agent can be finicky, these kinds of things. And then their next message to me was about 2 weeks later, and it was their manuscript. Like, can you take a look at my manuscript? And that's a no. Like, I don't have time to look at the 300-page manuscript, and so that's not the way that you want to go about it. But just kind of saying, look, I thought this was great. Smaller presses, I've reached out to some authors recently because I do book reviews, which is another thing that I recommend for you guys if you're looking to publish or you're getting started out. Get involved. See if you're reading a lot, write a review and send it to some of these magazines because they'll take it because they're all looking for book reviews. That's how I got in with the Kenyon review, and that's how I was able to start my own. I write a monthly review called The New and the Old and the Obscure for Style Weekly in Richmond. And so I get to review 3 books a month. And so, but that gets your name out there. Anything that gets your name out there and also kind of gets you that connect can be helpful. And so I do think it's important. Publishers feel it's important, but the story is ultimately the biggest thing. That's still the biggest thing. But it's also dependent on the book that you're writing. If you're writing something that's very I don't know, has to do with Twitter or Instagram like, or if it's like kind of this maybe just quirky little book that can be worked where Instagram and Twitter and all those things can be worked into it, then I guess that's helpful. But I'm not sure. I don't pay as much mind to it as I probably should. But at the same time, I find that it's helpful just to be lifting each other up more than anything. And if something comes down the road, I know that these people I've chatted with and they can be really helpful to me and I can be helpful to them. And so yes and no is the final answer to the question. So what do I think of self-publishing from Sarah? It depends. I don't think self-publishing is a good idea unless you've exhausted all of your choices. If you were to self-publish, I'd first try to go through the Amazon portal just because you'll get a lot more notice. But then you're serving at the Lord of Amazon, so I don't know how you feel about that. So to me, if you're writing a novel, if you're writing anything that's greater than 100 pages, it's worth really mining through all the publishers that you can. One book, so for instance, there was this book, I want to say 2006, 2007, called Tinkers. And it was a little book, just about 120 pages. No one would publish it. Everybody turned it down. The writer, I can't remember the writer's name, but the writers went to the Iowa Writers Workshop, which is the most prestigious one. He was teaching at Harvard. So you would think that would mean instant book, no matter what it was, right? And so, but no, you got rejected all over. The press that ended up buying it, they bought it for $5,000. It was Bellevue Literary Press, which is the mental health press out of New York State. They do not sell many books. They do not appear in many bookstores. But that year, if I got the year right, 2006 or 7, that book won the Pulitzer Prize. And so it's worth going through all of the time that it takes to mine publishers and wait, because that book could get a following. I was reading some story recently. I forget who the author is, but she's passed on now, but some book that she had, there had been a movie deal for like 30 years ago that would have made her very famous and whatnot. Now it's being made into a movie. These weird things happen. Dances with Wolves was a one-off Western paperback that was stuck in a back of an airplane chair that Kevin Costner just picked up and started reading. Whether it's a good movie or not, I don't know. I've never seen the movie or the book. I just like the story of how it happens. So it can happen. It can happen, but I think self-publishing can be scary, first of all, because you're responsible for a lot of your sales. And then second of all, because it's not seen as reputable by academics, publishers, what you're trying to do down the road. But there have been successes, more so with people who write series of books that fans can follow. But as like a novel that you wrote, I would try to find a publisher for it. And you have a lot of publishers to look for. And one, Northwestern University is very good. Syracuse has a very good press. And BOA does fiction and poetry and flash fiction. And so there's a whole number of presses, but I would mine those first before self-publishing. So I kind of like this. The questions come in and I answer them as we go on. All right, so I got it. What do I think about Goodreads from Laurel? Well, one time I was on Goodreads and someone someone wrote a bad review of my book, and they got like a whole part of it all wrong and mentioned that I need to do my research. And I was like, I started typing away. You need to do your research because there's Joe's Lake and Joe's River. And it's this famous part in Notre Dame. I had this like scene on the campus, and it was someone from South Bend, Indiana, who thought I had gotten the thing wrong. And I was like, you live in South Bend, you should know the difference, blah, blah, blah. And then when I clicked to send, Goodreads says, do you really want to send this? If you're the author, they tell you not to send it. I think I go with the bad press is good press, the whole thing. So my novel was very divisive, and that's good for me because it came out the exact way I wanted it to. My first draft was, I didn't feel good about it, and the publishers liked it. They had some comments on it, but I just didn't feel like it was capturing what I wanted. And I took a very big risk and kind of went off the radar for 3 months and rewrote the whole entire thing. Not much of the content changed, but a lot of the way I told the story changed. And I was super happy with it. And then I was just kind of praying, what are they going to think? And then they loved it. And so it worked out. But, I can't, you can't you can't get into it. You can't get angry at someone for having an opinion and not understanding how long it took for you to get to this point, right? Because in the end, you're trying to entertain and inform and offer insight that nothing else can but fiction. For me, fiction is the closest that we get to another's thought and imagination. And so I can't help if someone has, a reaction to my piece that disagrees with me in some way. I just want the reaction because then I know that I did something, then I know that thing that I put in the world, gave someone a reaction or made someone feel something. I'm not sure if that's everything you're asking about Goodreads. It's good to be on there and to again to kind of develop that snake of readers, and there's a lot of people on there who their whole job is to go on and review books and put it up on Goodreads. A lot of publishers will go on there, and so it is useful. But what's very useful if you're an author and you have friends who are authors is to just go on there and give them 4 or 5 stars and say how much you like the book, because that's what gets, if you do like the book. Well, I guess if you're a friend, you don't want to write a bad review of your friend's book, but it is helpful to review other authors that you enjoy. It does increase sales. So overall, I don't think any of these sites are good for monopolizing communication and driving sales. Most likely word of mouth is still one of the best sequences. Book clubs also, and first edition clubs are another way for you to get associated with authors. So for me, I do a lot of chats like this for book clubs. And let's say you are in a chat like this with me. Well, you guys are in a chat like this with me. So if you're feeling like you have something and you can't find the way to get it connected with someone else, those are the times where you might want to reach out. So there's a lot of ways to do that. And I think these are Twitter, Instagram, these Goodreads are just some of them. So let's look at Susan saying, so less on the publishing side of things, but where do you get the initial idea for your books? Does it start with a character, a full plot, a single image, or a single image? you talked about this a little bit before, but do you always know when something is going to be a novel as opposed to something shorter? So for me, when I start out, it starts out with a voice. I'll hear a voice of some kind. I hear voices. So I it starts out in a way that, so for example, the story that I'm finishing right now that I really like, and it's a pandemic story, so it was kind of a risk to write it, but it was basically about, I was I was with my son. We had pancakes. There was no syrup. I felt really guilty. I was like, I got to get the syrup. There's no syrup. And then it was, oh, I got to get the mask. I don't think I have gas in my car. It was like this whole thing. And then I was like, but I need the syrup. I need, and just the word syrup just kept like becoming syrupy in my head. And I was like, if I don't get the syrup, I'm going to be a big failure. And I was like, it would be interesting if this guy, like, I guess someone like me, well, interesting and also true that like you have to almost like guard up to go get this like one thing you want to be good to your son, who is also kind of going through this, who's also going through this whole pandemic, and you want to be that hero, and you and it's about someone worried about failing, even though you know you're going to fail a little anyway. And so obviously he does do some failing and some succeeding in the end. So for me, it starts with a voice, sometimes a word, sometimes an emotion. It rarely starts with a character or a plot or an image. I tend to let the plots develop on their own. What ends up in this story is that the character goes through a bunch of mishaps along the way to trying to find the syrup, and one of them is also getting lost because all the neighborhoods look the same, like a lot of these small towns where they all look like mini towns, and the subdevelopments, and so he loses his way and ends up in a house that looks like his with a family that looks like his, and wakes up the next day with pancakes and syrup, but it's the wrong family. And so I didn't see that coming at all, because like I said, it just started out with this idea of this guy that needs to go get syrup. And I will often let these kind of, the idea percolate for about a week. That's a Sharon Olds, the poet. That's her, something I remember her saying is that I think she gives it 3 days. And if it's gone, then she doesn't use it. If it stayed with her, then she finds it useful. So I follow that rule sort of by a week, and then it means that something's there. The novel that I wrote, I knew it was a novel just because it was about a family. I wanted to do 4 characters, and I wanted to span a lot of time. And I kind of wrote it in a way that was short story form. Like I gave everybody their own story, but I tend to think those are the best novels, where the chapters work giving voice to a specific scene or a specific character. And for example, I don't know if anybody here has read A Visit from the Goon Squad. There's a book it's all short stories that are combined that end up making a novel. Even in first person, I think that writer who did Cloud Atlas, David Mitchell, I think his name is. He did a book about a kid who was 13, Black Swan Green, I want to say. And it just followed, I think it followed each chapter followed each month in his year as a 13-year-old. Michael Cunningham works his novels with time, marks everything with time. So for me, if I'm working on a novel, if I want to do a novel, it's really, how do I want to work with time? Because working with time is the hardest thing I feel in writing. And so if I want to span a number of years, I can do that in a short story, but I have to feel comfortable in knowing that I'm only working around one idea. or two characters. If I'm working with a whole bunch of characters, it's very difficult for me to get into their minds and their goings on, and to make it suitable for a reader to understand while also spanning a whole lot of time. One of the authors that can do that really well is Annie Proulx, and Alice Munro does it really well too. But then again, they're writing kind of like 50-page stories. So, you know, not all the time, but some of their longer ones that are dealing with a span of time are writing these longer stories. So for me, getting in, knowing it's a novel is knowing when I have more than one set of characters. Like I know that character is going to be encountering different characters that I need to give their own stories to. And then also place. What am I dealing with place? Because that's its own character too. If I have a character who's traveling, I need to allow time for that, and I need to allow time to set that up. And it's sort of my belief that all of us now would be writing way shorter material anyway, because naturally our attention spans are short, and because in the days of like Russian literature and early English literature, you know, they had to spend like 50 pages setting up the scene, because people enjoyed that, because they didn't have TVs or radios, or that was the only way they got to know like Paris, you know. We don't require that information anymore. So it's a wonder why sometimes publishers do, you know, want you to hit like an 80,000 word limit or something like that. I feel like if you go into thinking about writing that way, it's going to be really detrimental, because you'll spend a lot of time filling space. And when you're filling space, what the reader's doing when they read that space filler is that they're filling their head with everything else that they have going on in their life. You know, you lost the reader. And so I don't really think of it so much as short story and novel as much as, oh, this thing's bigger and I got to let it breathe. So hopefully that's helpful in explaining that. Connie asked about finding book clubs. I think if some of you guys can share that in the chat would be good. There are a number of websites you can go to. The best thing to do is go to whatever your local bookstore's website is. They usually have a book club. Every Barnes and Noble has like a bunch of book clubs, but
Your local library.
And your local library.
Yes.
Or like, I know it's silly, but you know, I do a teen online book club, and I pop that to Connie privately, but yeah, I
There we
mean,
go.
your local library. I do a virtual one, and actually it was just before this. You know, we read all kinds of books, not just, you know, your regular novels, but, you know, graphic novels, and I get their input on things, and we read really depressing stuff. And we try to connect like those old books to new books. So we read Call of the Wild, and then we read Into the Wild. So there was those connections there. And then, you know, I also try to connect your book to the movie, or that kind of thing. So that brings it a little bit more close to home. It engages them in different ways. So that attention span issue that we were talking about is addressed to where they still find it fun and interesting to read long, boring books. Of course, Call of the Wild is only 7 chapters.
Right.
So, I mean, you know, talk to your local librarian and see if they don't already have one, if they wouldn't mind you like bringing your friends to the library to have a book club. That's always helpful too.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. And I'm finding I'm getting a lot of invites from just private Skype, you know, book clubs. Yeah. I have this, I wanted to do this right before the pandemic started. I had a few people coming over, it was just going to be people struggling with substance abuse and needing a place to like hang out, and what we were going to do is read a couple stories and talk about those stories, stories based along, you know, people talking about their own substance abuse. And so it was specific, but it was something that I was really thought would be really enchanting in a way to have these kind of, because I've taught in the Richmond City Jail, and when I teach and they start to open up, it's like it's so tight and close and like hardened in there that when we just started talking and sharing stories, it kind of like softened a little. And I think stories have that power. So finding a way to connect about books is great. So Jerome asked, what do you think are some good ways to spark a story when you're having trouble writing? I will say that I am not a believer in writer's block at all. And I say it gladly and with confidence, because there's too much to write about. That should be the problem. There's too much. I can't write. So just say that. Don't say I don't know what to write about. Say there's too much. It'll make you feel better. It's good to be overwhelmed. It's especially good to be overwhelmed with your own writing and your ideas. If you don't have anything, but you're feeling the drive to write, then you're already writing, because the main thing for me, that might have been the first thing I wrote down when I started thinking about this class, was training the mind to believe in and question everything at the same time. That's so difficult to do, especially right now in these times. But for instance, it was important for me, not from any kind of human kind standpoint, but just to be like, I wonder what this guy's like, because I didn't know my neighbor like down the street a little was a huge Trump supporter until he put up this no more bullshit Trump 2020 sign that was bigger than his house. And I needed to kind of like, and even though it frustrated me and annoyed me and that I didn't agree with him, I just wanted to go over and talk to him and see, and just be like, hey, neighbor, and maybe get invited into his house, look around, maybe see what's going on in the yard, see how the kids are, because that's all observation. That's all input for me. I don't know if it's anything I'm going to use, but I have to be interested in the things that, you know, make me uncomfortable. I have to believe in it. Like, what is that to believe? What is it to be QAnon? Like, how would I be able to believe in that? And you can see it in great interviewers. They do a good job of it. If you get a chance, if you enjoy interviews, you get a lot out of hearing the interviewer more. For me, I get a lot more out of hearing the person interviewing than I do the person being interviewed, because the way they ask questions is the way to tell the story. They're getting a story out in an hour, and the good ones know how to do it in a way that is really mind-blowing. And I don't know if they get enough credit for how they're able to get a story out of someone. And it's never a story that you know is coming, like we were just speaking about, like knowing your ending, knowing your plot. They just have the questions that will lead to something interesting. And so for me, believing in and also questioning everything is really something that drives my writing. And if I'm ever kind of feeling like, oh, today I don't have anything to write about, I pull out old notes, I go through old books, I kind of think about a character sketch, anything to kind of spark a little movement. And I think you can feel satisfied that you've done a piece of something. If it's a longer story, a longer piece, and you feel like I need to write this long thing, or I need to get this novel because an agent is asking me for a novel, I've been down that road and it's not a good one. And so I would write what you feel like you need to be writing now, and really try to feel comfortable in that, because if you do, it shows in the work, and that's what's important. It also shows in the work when it's not going really well. And so not writing what you're feeling is going to affect your output. Yes, Sarah said you have to put yourself in someone else's shoes.
Well, it's more like, I mean, you were talking about the interviewer. The interviewer is kind of like not biased, right? They're just like a blank canvas. All they are is the questions, right?
Mhm.
And so they're not putting themselves into it. And so being the observer, you're not making judgments during that observation. Like you said, going to your neighbor's house that you may not agree with his political connections, but you want to know like where he's coming from, right?
Right,
So
right.
you leave your judgments out of it so that you can really see like the truth of that person and where they're coming from.
And what happens is the judgment will not offer you so in my classes in writing and just specific writing classes, I'll talk often about opportunity, taking advantage of opportunity. If you've already judged a character on the page, then you've closed an opportunity for that character to either change or to offer something biting or to offer something surprising. You've really closed down an opportunity. And so that's another reason why it's important not to go into your writing with kind of a plan or a kind of a, what do you call it, a stance, unless you're doing an opinion piece, say, or an essay. Sorry to interrupt
Right.
you.
No, it's cool. When Jerome asked about like, you know, like that sparking a story, having trouble writing, and like you said, like there's so many stories there. Like you can just throw out a word and think of a story, like right now, like we do with the program right now, with Susan and the Muse. Like doing exercises like that help you spark those stories that are there and kind of focus them in a way, writing lists, that kind of stuff. But yeah, it's really because there's so many stories there that you need to like hone in or practice. How do you pull that story out and write it down? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, definitely. I actually did this the other day. Let me take another quick share. Like I just thought this was kind of funny, and then I was thinking, oh, I wonder if I just kind of do some character sketches or something, and then I was like, no, let me just see if I can attach emotions to each of them, and some of them came out funny, you know. So it's like Hunter's depressed, Putman's poor, Roman's wrong. So it's just these kind of like just silly things that then would allow me to think about, okay, well, why is Benny stumped? You know, why is Linda drunk? Why is Roman wrong? You know, and just opening that up is me trying to then figure out, okay, there's a story, you know. Because sometimes these things are, you know, you'll hear, I think it was John Gardner who said every story is about someone leaving a place or returning to one. You know, Kurt Vonnegut has a whole idea of what, you know, that there's just 7 shapes to stories. And you can find all those online. And so, yeah, there's a lot of stories to tell. I think what writer's block really is taking on more than you can chew, saying, I need to get to, like, I am not a big fan of Nano Writing Month. You know, I don't, like I said, my first story, which was published in 2007 or 8, didn't make its way into the book until 2016 and wasn't really finished in 2008. And technically, I think the story probably took me about 9 years to write, and it's only 3,000 words long. So I don't know, you know, and 3 of the stories in the book I wrote in one day and did not change much. And so that's how it can go sometimes. and it's sort of like being at a craps table. You just got to catch it when it's hot, and that's
It's
trusting,
funny
you know,
you
that's trusting
mentioned
the
the
instincts.
NaNoWriMo because I did that program with my teens actually, and it's not just a month. You know, it was actually 3 months. So like the first month is, all that pre-writing exercises of getting your character sketches and all of that together. So, even if they didn't finish the novel by the end of the whole program, um, just the fact that they might have done the assignments where they made that character is something that they could go back to later. It wasn't the achievement for me and teaching that program with the teens was more about the activities and the fact that they were really engaged during it, not the final result, you know?
Right. Yeah, of course. In my writing classes, especially at William and Mary, they would get very confused because I'd say, I'm not going to grade you. I'm just going to, if the story gets better, if you've improved on your first draft of your story, you'll get an A. Because really, I just
Right.
wanted to see them put the work in. And that's like the one of the kind of last things I did want to talk about was the discipline aspect, taking the time and being disciplined at putting down that many pages, that many mistakes. The reason why I say the nano thing is just because I don't know, the pressure of time for me sometimes is I see it in students where they feel like they have to finish something and you get the last 2 pages very unfinished. And I think it affects the first 3 or 4 pages because they're rushing towards something. I think that's something that we all do anyway, but I wouldn't want someone to feel like they failed at a story and not go back to it,
Mm-hmm.
because there's a lot sometimes that you find in these old stories, or these things that you tried that you give up on, and then some months later, years later, you go back to it and you say there was something there. And that's happened for me a couple of times. But it's all helpful to get something down and to learn from each other. And anytime you have people with their eyes on your work, that's a gift. Like these kinds of workshops and stuff are gifts, because once you're out of a writing program or group, it's very hard to say, hey, will you look at my 20-page story? I mean, I can't imagine, for Jerome, it was easy to say, will you look at this? Will you take a look at this? It's asking for someone's time. It's asking for their attention. It's saying, I feel good about this. Like I want, so it's difficult, but at the same time, having that community where you have people that will be honest with you about your writing is really one of the biggest advantages that you will have over other writers. So having a little group, especially people you trust that will be honest, is really helpful. Okay, so Jerome asking, what techniques in storytelling do you believe are most important to learn? For example, not using too many attributions. What do you mean by attributions, Jerome?
So what I mean by attributions is basically, I might have used the wrong word, but kind of like when you say, said lazily, said passionately, or retorted. That's what I mean when I say that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I just wrote down here um, the techniques that I think are most important to storytelling: action, exposition, dialogue, details, and place. In terms of attribution, I always say said and say, or I don't say anything. The one little kind of nugget I'll give you is that from an editing standpoint, if someone in the previous paragraph we know is about to speak, then they don't need an attribution. And that's how you can avoid using so many. And then the next person we know. So if we know two people are in a room and one is set to speak in the paragraph, in the actual action, we don't need attributions at all afterwards. Because I understand what you're saying. It can get a little jarring, but it does get jarring if they change a lot too. So it does feel weird if someone says, Patrick said angrily, "You're wrong," she retorted. That sounds weirder than said, these things. But the way to kind of get out of that is be more action oriented. And that's why that's always the first in my storytelling techniques. And so what agents, editors, publishers want to see is action right away. They want to be in the story right away. My biggest mistake as a writer is I'll start off in action and then I'll go on for a 10-page tangent about this person's life when they were in Texas when they were 14. That has nothing to do with the story. And eventually gets deleted. And I tell myself not to do it every time, and every time I do the same thing. But exposition is needed. And that is the hardest part, because that's where time comes in. That's where place makes an appearance as a character, not just on its own. That's where all your characters' emotional baggage is. And if you've read kind of those great novels where they don't go too much into the backstory, you just feel the backstory through the action. And one I'm rereading, I don't, it's not here, it's somewhere else. It's called Fat City. I'll write it here. It's a boxing novel, but it's more than that. And it's a guy, he just wrote one novel his whole life. It's short and it's just so powerful. It's not even really about boxing. It's just kind of about these guys in a ragtag, place, Salinas, California. It kind of picks up where Steinbeck left off and shows you this world of kind of like an underbelly circle of guys that are kind of down on their luck and fighting for money. But everything is in this action, and you get the feeling of their exposition, of their backstory from what they're doing. So you just get little pieces of where they might have been before, and that's enough exposition. But the action actually tells you more about the character. Dialogue is really difficult to capture. It's something that you have to spend time listening to other people. In Virginia, it's against the law to tape them, so don't tape them. But sometimes if you're just, close to other people and you listen to them talk, it can be, and you're jotting down notes, and then you look at those notes on your screen, it's like a master puzzle that it's amazing how we talk. I don't know if this program does it, but I know Zoom will take all of your notes, like your entire talk, and show the whole thing. So even something like that can show you dialogue, and you can see, okay, this is how people actually talk. And one of the things I'm very proud of in the novel is that, and the best, criticism that I got about it was the dialogue was very accurate. Like, this was how people talked in the Northeast, and this was how, and they connected to that. And also it reveals a lot about character and place. Details is just like it says descriptions, just being specific, being able to look at something with your own unique perspective. I took a class with Mary Gateskill, and I was just telling the story to someone where she had said she spent, I think it was 6 or 7 hours just trying to describe how the sun looked shining down on a wet stone driveway. It was just one sentence, and she spent 6 or 7 hours. Now, not all of us have 6 or 7 hours to spend on one sentence, but for her, she had to get that thing just right, And she has a story. I'll put that here. Mary Gateskill. The Old Virgin is the name of the story. And there's a point in it, there's a detail in it where she describes it's about a nurse who is in Houston and having just a bad overall day. And she goes out into the humidity and she says like her body feels gross. And I just like really love that description, because as we all know in this area of Virginia in about 2 months. If you're like me, you get out of the shower and you immediately start sweating with the humidity, and I feel gross in the summer, especially in Richmond. Yeah, I guess you guys have some sea breeze, but at times it does feel very gross. So being detailed in description, especially with how something looks or appears, for me, metaphor isn't as important as something like that. Saying something looks like, you know, a coil, or I'll tell my students to go out and just dig their hands in dirt and just feel like what that feels like, because it's cool underneath. Um, so things like that I think are important. And then the last one is place, and place is really one of the best um, pieces I've ever read on place is by Eudora Welty. It's called Place and Fiction, and I believe you can get the PDF online. Um, and she just talks about place as a character. And so I've had, these points where students will argue with me about a place. I'll say why. I had a student write a story that was about a breakup, and at one point she says the character got out of the car and threw their cell phone into the field and laid in the road for an hour. And then it had blank space, and then it was the next day. And I kind of stopped and I said, okay, well, what happened during that hour? And she's like, well, we were in Hanover County, and I don't know what that is, right? And so when I said I didn't know what that was, everybody laughed at me because, okay, the 20 kids in the room knew what Hanover County was, but I didn't, and everybody outside doesn't know either. So no one's going to know what you're talking about. And my first question is, what happened during that hour? And then she kept kind of saying nothing happened because there's nothing in Hanover County. And I was like, well, are there corn stalks? Is there grass? The absence of something would be something, right? If there wasn't anything there, that would be mind blowing. You would have a whole nother story. Like I broke up with someone and stopped in the middle of the road, and I realized that I was in no place. There were no roads, no grass, no farmland. And then I was also thinking about, okay, but let's say it was quiet and there were no other cars. What sounds were going on? Just the gurgling of your stomach, just anything like that. What animals might have been rustling nearby. So that also goes back to, so you can see how all five of those things work together. So technique wise, that is always what I'm focusing on. One thing to think about is looking at commercials, because they're 30 seconds long and they do all five things every time. Um, the hair commercials, it's kind of like, okay, someone's washing their hair, but it's unsatisfactory. So they decide to get this herbal essence hair product that has blah, 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 blah. That's the exposition. And then in those, the dialogue is usually like, ooh, this is so refreshing, blah, blah, blah. And then the details about how it smells and how it's tropical. And the place is your shower and then a jungle or something, and then back to the shower. And it's 30 seconds long. And so you can see how they do it. And you can see how if one was left out, like when you watch like an infomercial or when you watch like a cheap commercial, something's left out. That's why it's cheap. It's just exposition or information. So sometimes those things can be helpful. Let me see here. Okay, so Sarah asks, when reading other people's work, do you have any pet peeves that bother you about the work? How it is written, dialogue, or time structure of the book, chapters? I think one pet peeve I have is titles. I think titles are really, I opened up talking about that. If you go into a bookstore, if you're a fan of any of these short story anthologies, if you just hold your hand over the authors and look at the titles, you can see why probably some of those were selected just based on the titles. You also want to think about, do you go in a bookstore, what gets your attention first? It's usually the title, sometimes it's the cover. So thinking about your title smartly and giving it as much time as everything else is really important. I also think about the first line a great deal, and then I think about the first paragraph a great deal. And so my pet peeves are that a writer writing a short story will say, oh, you have enough time to get through me going on for a page or two without getting to the action. And so that's what I look for right away is, are we in a story that's an original, unique voice? If I'm thinking about how it is written, I don't know, you'd have to be a little more specific on, if you mean genre, I think, no, I don't have any pet peeves on what people write about or how they write. Maybe I have pet peeves with publishers who stretch books out again to make it like look like it's 250 pages when it might just be 100 pages. But
Okay, so let me just really, you were talking about like the chapters and time and how each chapter can kind of set up the time, and you're talking about going back and forth between the characters. So like you said, like the publishers, it feels like sometimes when I'm reading books, which I read a lot, so I mean I read at least 10 books a week, so when I'm reading, and I have a chapter that begins with the same dialogue that the last chapter ended, it like it really irritates me. I'm like, but I know what they said. They just said it in the last paragraph, you
right.
know. So it drives me crazy. So I feel like I could skip half the book just by taking out those chapters, or you know, just those points. Why do we need to I don't know, restate the same thing over again? It would be different. So, what is it? I'm sorry, I'm thinking of Stephanie Myers and the vampire books. So she wrote the Midnight Sun, which is from the point of view of the male character. And she wrote it like after the first one was already published. It's basically the same story, but it's from his point of view. So you get that exposition from his mind, right? So it wasn't redundant, right? It wasn't the same story over again because it was from his point of view. The dialogue was the same, but it was only those short moments of the actual spoken word, right? So I mean, she did it successfully, but in books where you have a character, it's the same scene, and they pick it up with a different character, and they repeat the same thing over again as exposition. Anyway, that's just my pet peeve.
Yeah, I mean that's difficult. I mean, you find that in Stephen King a lot, but and that might
Yes.
just be in editing. I mean, how much time do you have to edit 1,000-page book from one author every 6 months, right? But certainly, I mean, for me, like for my novel, I time-stamped 3 sections, and because I knew those were the sections I wanted to cover, and that helped me to open everything up. The chapters were separated by scenes, where it was focused on one character, and I tried to build off previous scenes and have time go that way. And then when I wanted to jump, see, what I wanted to do was have all the adults be in the mind of all the adults, and that meant the children 30 years later. And so what I did was have, the children as children, their parents, we were in their minds, and then 30 years later we were in the children's minds as adults. And that to me was a successful way of doing it. I think a pet peeve of mine is when, you know, it becomes a pattern that's not very satisfying. Like, we just keep going back to the same scene, and that scene is supposed to inform every movement that the character makes in the present. That to me does not seem, that to me feels like, that to me, I can see the writer at work. And when I'm seeing the writer try to contort the narrative, which is what we're trying to do, it takes away from my experience as a reader, you know. And so um, that framing things in a way, I think, can kind of hinder your writing rather than open it up a little. Does that help?
Yeah, it brings you out of the scene in a way.
Yeah.
Where you come to that little pet peeve, like you're reading along and I can see the images in my mind and I'm there and it's flowing well. And then all of a sudden they repeat it over again. I'm like, why is the scene the same thing? You know,
Right.
it's just the same thing over again. It doesn't add to the story. And really that's just one pet peeve. I have a whole lot of them.
Yeah.
But I mean, is it helpful as a writer to know those pet peeves of your audiences? You know what I mean? So
Yeah,
that
it's helpful to know who your audience is, because, you know, for me, for literary fiction, it's a small group of 20 somethings, and then it's 35 to 65-year-old women. I mean, that's the facts that they put out in front of me, you know, and of who is buying the books that are in my kind of like wheelhouse. Um, I don't know how helpful it is to focus on that as much as be aware that you do not want to be that writer, that the writer that you are is someone who is confident that the reader is smart enough to know where we're picking up, you know, from, you know. That's why mine were simple timestamps, but the scenes I allowed to the reader to get into. It wasn't Philadelphia West 35th Street next to such and such bar, you know,
yeah,
where you're already giving the person their setting before. And again, that's losing an opportunity because anything can happen on that corner right there to give detail to that corner, you know, without the author having to provide it. So, um,
yeah, we read The Curious Case of the Dog in the Nighttime.
yeah,
So, I mean, the story, you know, written from, you know, an autistic boy's point of view, and he used those types of things like the time stamping to really like, you know, because he was a detective or being a detective during the story. And I particularly
right,
liked that to where it fed into the character and you know the character himself to where you really could understand like the mental health of him, like you could tell where his mind was going and how it was working based on the way that the book itself was written.
yeah, yeah. That's a really powerful book, and again, that's a book that starts right out in action and voice, right?
Yes,
Um,
yes.
so, uh, so Laurel asked, you spoke about MFA programs at the beginning. If someone has not taken an MFA program, it would not be able to fit one into their life for a few years. Are there any textbooks that you would recommend reading in the meantime? Um, well, first, if you are interested in MFA programs, there's a lot of low residency ones that are that don't require you to spend much time at a specific place. I think, for example, Warren Wilson in Asheville does one, and you go down twice a year uh, and meet everybody. The rest is done pretty much online, but you're working with published authors. In terms of books that help, um, trying to think if there's any book that's really that I really got a lot of help from writing wise. I think I tend to think these are more helpful. Like a class, like just hearing from an author has been the most helpful for me. I went to a lot of lectures. I I've attended a lot of conferences, and I've heard, you know, what ends up happening is you hear everybody has a unique point of view, and a lot of times it counters what you just heard yesterday. So, uh, you know, um, is it better to get published early or later, or what happens, or these kinds of things. And so, for me, the best books are the books that I love, and rereading them. I think that's the best way to do it. Rereading is the best way. And so there are a set of books that I read every year. Um, and they're fast reads once you reread. It's a real kind of strange thing the brain does just to move you through it again, but you always pick up something different. Short stories I reread, not for pleasure, for study. Um, but I can't think of a very specific writing book. I mean, book on writing that has helped me as much as just kind of specific lessons. The Paris Review does a good job of releasing all their interviews and essays, and so looking there, they'll probably have a writer of someone that you know or respect, and they are helpful guides in their process. So I kind of take from everywhere, but more than anything, I take from the books that I have found to be the most powerful in and also the books that I love but are so out of my wheelhouse, like I couldn't imagine writing them. But sometimes those are the books where I'm like, oh, I'm the worst, because I want to write like this, but it's not me. So but I think keeping yourself surrounded. I was just reading an essay by Zadie Smith, uh, a series of lectures she gave, and one of them was like how some authors or some people don't like to surround themselves with good novels or other people's work. And she says, I just have it all. I have it all on my desk. I have every influence, everything, pages everywhere. And so people do it differently, but I like the influence of other authors and how they're working their way through time and space and place. And so I find that that's the best teaching.
Do you ever like write with other authors? And I put this out there mainly because I'm an artist. So like, if you know anything about art in general, like the Dadaists and the Exquisite Corpse, where groups of people would get together, you pass around a piece of paper and draw parts of a body, right? So you draw the head and then you hide the head and somebody else draws the arms. But the writers, they also did it too. That were part of that group. And I can't remember their names off the top of my head. I think it's Andre Breton, was also a writer. But anyway, have you ever done anything like that where
I'm working on, the novel. So in this pandemic, before the pandemic, I finished up a novel that I want to be slightly illustrated. We have some interest. I haven't kind of like been like, let's go ahead, because I feel like it should be illustrated. And then it just so happens that I met someone, and it turns out she's an illustrator. So this seems to be like it's going to be my first collaboration of that kind, although she's not very happy with me today. So
Well,
who
it was
knows?
more about like taking the writing portion and writing together with another author to create something together that is a novel, And I know some authors already do that. I don't know if
Well,
it's as specific as an Exquisite Corpse, but
if you're thinking about like a James Patterson type thing, that's different because so a lot of
I
those
don't
authors of
think.
the big books, of those like big published books, are offering um what do you call it, a storyboard, and
Mhm.
those authors fill in the storyboard. It has to follow the like Patterson like line or whatever.
I don't really like Patterson.
Yeah, I mean, and yeah, that's just an example, but that I think a lot of the co-authors, that's kind of what they have to do. But no, I mean, I haven't thought of it. I've done shorter pieces. I've done a little call and response, but I don't know the right, you know, I've written two teleplays, and so what I learned from doing that was, two screenplays for television. And what I learned from doing that was once I'm once I've written it, it's going to change completely because there's
Right.
too many people involved. And I don't know if I like that much. I don't know. It might not be that I don't like it, but what it feels like to me is like I really carefully think about like each line.
Mhm.
And if it's immediately going to get changed, if it's going to be a collaboration, obviously I start to get a little defensive. So I would have to break down some walls to get into that space where I felt comfortable enough to be like, okay, let's work on this together. I
Mhm.
I have found it a little easier when I'm doing something humorous, but I think if it's something that's deep, like family related, or if it's fiction that's coming from something personal, that
Mhm.
that would be too difficult to take on, I think. Yeah, I think it would just be a matter of are you willing to give up a
Of
piece
the
of yourself?
control.
Yeah,
Right.
because and one of kind of my few last little tidbits is that I had a I had a teacher. I did a at the New York State Writers Institute. This short story writer named Lee K. Abbott passed away recently. Um, really taught me a lot in just the 2 weeks that I knew him. But one of the things he said, if you don't feel like you've given a piece of yourself away, um, then you probably haven't finished the story yet. And that piece is just like something inside you. So like when I finish like a story that I know is worth sending out into the world, I feel like something has been given to that story that's no longer with me. I don't know how everyone would feel that personally, but it is it was very powerful for him to say that because I had so much brewing in my head about, and you guys might be writing stuff that's not personal at all, but you do have specific emotions that can fit into that story. And so I was feeling like I was just trying to get a story down rather than get my actual self and voice and a piece of me into that. Um, it, Jerome had mentioned a couple books. I know these authors, Jeff Vandermeer. I didn't know he published this book. I had seen it coming together online. Benjamin Percy is the author who I was talking about when I was saying graduate students send in their stories. I was editing Salt Hill at Syracuse when I got Benjamin Percy's first story. Um, and we published it, and it was a nice query letter, and it was a good story. And yeah, so that is a recommended book. Um, Another question here: when you reread your favorite books, do you deconstruct the plot, story, characters to see how they do it? I I do. I don't know if I. That's a good question. I don't. Well, story and plot, I would say, are similar. I don't think I deconstruct the characters as much as I kind of separate the characters out of what was one character's path, what was the other character's path, and maybe a third, fourth, fifth. And I'll see how the ancillary characters fit. One kind of lie that I think exists in writing is that there are round characters and flat characters. I feel like everybody's a round character. If that character is there, they're there for some kind of purpose, even if that purpose is only a one-dimensional thing. They need to have some flavor, they need to have some kind of tick or something that makes them a character. Just throwing anybody in there, I don't see that in the books that I reread. I see these ancillary characters who feel like I know them, even if it's like a brawl at a bar or like a scene at a sporting event. I will feel like I have seen these characters. But usually I trace the path of the main characters and the ancillary characters. And I see how they have changed over time. I see how their descriptions have changed. I see how their dialogue has changed, especially if it's a longer work. And what that does for me is it informs how this story was told in such a short manner. The biggest thing for me is that I constantly work on the thing that I told you guys about at the beginning, which is how did this person avoid the dreaded 10 pages of exposition that's going to take the reader out of the story in the first place. And so I find that some of my favorite books do that so well with scene. They open their novel with a specific scene. And when you think about it that way, you're right in action, dialogue's going to be needed. And if you come across something that, let's say, is violent or surprising or sexual, you are going to need to have some exposition. So it allows all those 5 things right away to say, I'm going to open up with a scene. And when I reread these books, I see that they have done just that. Some authors do a good job of opening their books with a story that kind of puts a umbrella over the whole rest of the book. I don't find it so much as a framing technique, but like Nabokov does that really well. He'll bring you a story that he's heard from someone else or that he overheard at a cafe, and that will put the whole book into perspective in some way. So you start to figure out when you're rereading how these authors got to an end point, how they picked up speed, how they developed time and space, and that's how I read them. So, but thank you for that question. I think we have like 5 minutes or so. If you guys have some specific questions for me, I don't have much more on my end. One thing I'll say about sending out is that if you're ready, if you feel the story is ready, I think I mentioned that early, start sending it and send the story to 20 different places. Don't, you know, the only time you have to worry is if you sent it to a place that's offering you $500 for it or a place that's offering you 1 copy and a pencil, and both of them take it, but the 1 copy and the pencil person took it before the $500 person. So take that into consideration, but send widely, read widely, and you'll find that you'll start to pick up, and then really trust those editors that they're looking for your stories. So and once you talk to these editors, then you've created a connection to more, especially some of these online outlets that are getting a lot of hits, you know, because you are getting your name out there that way. And some magazines, I think publishing online through them is better than being in print. So, but any last questions for me?
What's a really great book you've read lately?
A really great book that I just finished was called The Little Virtues by Natalia Ginsburg.
And what are, oh, sorry, go ahead.
These were just short essays. It was written after her husband was persecuted and beaten in prison and had a cross like burned into his body. And then she, I think, moved to Rome with a new husband and started writing these pieces. And they're so, it's just been a while since I picked up a book and didn't want it to end. And it's only like 120 pages and it's 6 or 7 essays, but they're so engrossing, and her voice is on every page. So if you pick that up in the next week, I think it'll help you understand more what I mean by voice. Like right away, you know it's Natalia Ginsburg. And I don't know anything about her, so I was doubly moved because I came into it blind, and it's rare that I find one of those. That's an older book. A newer book that I've read that was really wonderful was I read. Now I'm looking at my books. Oh, I read this book of short stories called Mannequin and Wife. And again, that was from that's from LSU Press. That was someone who reached out to me on Facebook and asked if I'd like to check out their book. And she sent me a picture of the cover and the picture. So again, titles, cover. Who wouldn't want to read Mannequin and Wife with this cover, right? And so I didn't think every story in it was great, but overall, I thought it was very well done and spoke to this time in a pretty interesting way. And so, not interesting. I don't like that word, but in a way that was that combined the kind of light, the humor and darkness in this way that's very satisfying to me. So that and but I read a lot of older stuff. I'm reading this older book by Michael Onadaatje, who wrote The English Patient. He wrote a book called Coming Through Slaughter about a New Orleans jazz musician who kind of drifted off. He was known as the most famous jazz musician, but he also had mental health issues that couldn't be solved at the time. And he writes it in kind of jazz form, which is really unique. And so those are some of the books that I usually have 5 or 6 going at once. So, I like I said, I just kind of surround myself with new and old. So
Can you share as well some of the good oldies that you go back to and reread every year?
yeah, I'll write these now. Revolutionary Road is one that I always go back to. And the reason why is because it's so it does such a good job of detailing a relationship falling apart, and it also adds this kind of life to it, this kind of joy. It's a very dark story, but it adds this kind of life to it that's very surprising at times, and that's really what I'm looking for when I'm rereading. Close Range by Annie Proulx. It's a short story collection. Again, where she does fables, she does family stories, she does like almost sci-fi type, like, but not really. I mean, she just has such a wide net. I read Humboldt's Gift by Saul Bellow because most of the novel takes place on a couch where the guy's just thinking about how he's going to solve some problems. And it's just mind blowing. I think Saul Bellow, he's one of my favorites. I read The Sheltering Sky by Paul Bowles, which is this is one of the novels where I follow 3 characters, their path, every time I read it and like how they got there. And it's very much like, because when you watch a TV show or a movie, like especially most movies are only about 16 to 17 actual scenes, whether that's separated from interior or exterior, what have you. So to see how a character can change so dramatically and they only have 5 or 6 scenes, that's really powerful how you do that writing. Jesus' Son, So Long, See You Tomorrow, and Autobiography of My Mother. Jesus' Son by Dennis Johnson, So Long, See You Tomorrow by William Maxwell, and Autobiography of My Mother by Jamaica Kincaid. I think those are three of the best examples of unique voice. One is a short story collection, one is a super short novel and novella, and Autobiography of My Mother feels like it's fiction, nonfiction, memoir, all wrapped into one with a voice that's so unique. That's one of the books that I make myself read because it embarrasses me how good it is. So I feel less than when I read it, but I also feel like I've gained something. So, but I think we're going to wrap up here. I hope that everybody enjoyed this. So hopefully you guys have a great night, and I will see you down the road.